Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session of Zymposium, where we're currently exploring different ways of building better open source. Joining me again this week is Tushar from Tailcall, which, why don't you do the elevator pitch, Tushar, just for folks who are new?
Sure.
What is Tailcall in
So,
a nutshell?
sure. So, tail call essentially bridges the gap between what the API actually is versus what is an optimal API going to look like. So, for a use case where you're building general purpose APIs, let's say there's the API that you build which exposes a lot of user information, maybe PII data, and you want to use it you designed it in a way that it can work for your mobile app and a CMS and all kind of use cases. Maybe that's not optimal for a front end mobile application which is trying to get user information which is potentially going to be used publicly, right? So you can't expose PII data there. You also want to show information about users, maybe friends, and that information is not available in that API. So you want to do some sort of orchestration over there and collect multiple APIs. So composition of APIs and those kind of things become sort of the fundamental to join to bridging that gap. So you have some API here and another version of the API that you would want to kind of use. That gap has to be bridged, and Tailcall provides those primitives to kind of compose these APIs, high level primitives that work on API and kind of compose them to build more powerful, more versatile API. That's what you're trying to do.
Fantastic. So, and Tailcall is 100% open source, which is, of course, why we're talking about it on the show. And in the last session, we did something quite unusual for early symposiums, which is we didn't write any code. We didn't even see any code. I guess we saw a little bit, maybe accidentally, in the background of GitHub,
Right. Yep.
but
Yep.
pretty much we didn't write any code. And instead, we talked about how we can improve, or rather, how we can create a positioning, a market positioning for tail call that is going to accelerate adoption. And I think that's one of the most important and underrated aspects of building open source is not just building the thing, but obviously building it with a product-oriented mindset which has you paying attention to features and target market and personas and all that, but also has you actively thinking about how do I talk about this to its target market? How do I get them excited? How do I persuade them to give this a try? How do I think like they think and put on their hat and say, this is going to be the most amazing solution to this particular class of pain that my target market has. And we did some exercises, some sort of, I would say, research almost, in putting together a bunch of notes from the last session. And I think in this session, we were going to try to take that all the way, and we're going to try to build some new positioning for tail call or tweak existing positioning for tail call based on those notes. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay,
Absolutely.
fantastic. Would you like to share your screen so we can
Yep.
briefly review what it is we came up with last week?
Okay. So the rough notes that we created, I sort of put it in a Google Doc. I don't know if it's readable.
Nice. I like it.
Is that readable?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Um, so what is tail call is a link to the website. Some of the things we discussed were around search terms. What are people looking for on the internet? Are they looking for BFFs, aggregation layers, API orchestration, composition, facade pattern? Some of these things are what people are kind of thinking of when they're thinking of the uh, problem space that tail call is in, right? From persona point of view, we basically at a high level have two personas: an individual contributor and a CTO or manager uh, kind of profile. And in an IC role, basically there could be a front end engineer who's primarily a consumer of the solution,
Hmm.
and then there's a backend engineer who could be consuming, but also primarily responsible for building it. This is something that I thought about probably later, which is the need for an orchestration layer is not just for the front end team, even backend use cases exist where you want to do these kind of things. Generally, people end up writing, smaller layers or a serverless
Yeah.
function and stuff. It's not as um, complex as what is required on the front end side.
Yeah.
So generally, people don't use these kind of backend for backend kind of layers.
Yeah.
At least I've not heard of them. Um, and then there's a full stack engineer, which we discussed that is not is barely ever going to use a solution like this because the coordination required between front end and back end doesn't exist. So they don't need this layer of abstraction that we are trying to build because the
Okay.
full stack engineer is doing the front end and the back end work. So they don't need anything to coordinate between the APIs and the consumption because they're the same person. Um, and then the fourth category is a DevOps, DevSecOps sort of a profile, which is for them, it's like a black box to maintain, and it should be secure, it should be fast, should have some telemetry capabilities. That's what we sort of created in terms of personas, like five personas.
Yeah.
Um, and we also went a little deeper in the front end persona. We talked about what are their likes, dislikes, and then we talked about the DevSecOps point of view. Why should they care about tail call? We discussed why backend engineers would not be interested in this space because it just seems like it's a problem for front end primarily, and they probably want to stick to their APIs that they build the general purpose reusable APIs. Um, and then we also discussed briefly about what does uh, an engineering manager or a CTO look for or is looking for when they are looking for a solution like tail call, right? What is the problem space that they are kind of working with or trying to solve where tail call could kind of fit in? Yeah, I
Fantastic.
think thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the summary. So before we continue, Baldwin has a note for full stack devs. Couldn't it still be relevant if they have to maintain multiple front ends with different requirements to the API? In other words, if they're supporting um, multiple web and or mobile apps and they have to
Yeah.
build lots of different APIs, couldn't a tool like this be somewhat interesting to them?
It could be. It could be. A lot of people actually um, just use this layer and just stick it on a database. So there's no business logic. A lot of the logic is on the front end, but it those kind of apps don't go beyond a prototype level. Is what I feel. As soon as it gets complex, you need a full-fledged backend system, a full-fledged front-end system. And if it's the same engineer who's doing this, it might be just more infrastructure to sort of manage. So it could be, but it's hard to kind of um, see real value for a full stack engineer.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. All right, so one of the things we talked about last week was just this notion that in order to be maximally effective, your positioning has to be directed towards a certain persona. And the better a fit, the more it's going to resonate with them and get them excited because you're talking in their language, you're talking about pains that they already have, and you're able to use terminology and motivational language and whatnot that's specifically tailored for them. And that can really be, it can be big. And I'll give you an example in non-tech field that I know about. If you go out there and you say something like, we are a general purpose legal firm and we have lawyers to handle every possible case, then getting that to resonate with people is pretty difficult. But if you go out of the door saying we are real estate lawyers and we only handle commercial real estate litigation, then suddenly all the people who have that problem choose you and they don't choose anyone else. As an example of people want something, they have all these solutions. They're looking for something that is exactly, or at least as close as possible, as specialized as possible to the specific pains and problems that they have. And so we decided to do that, I think, last week, basically, with this positioning, is go after one of these personas. And we decided tentatively, I think, on targeting just the front end persona rather than sort of both front end and back end, even though you can do that by using mixed signals in your messaging. We decided to target just the front end persona and maybe throw a few bones to management and back end engineers or give that front end persona ammunition they can use to convince management and convince the back end engineer. But now you've had a chance to sit on this, I think, for a week. Has anything changed? Are you still thinking that's the persona we need to at least experiment with for this
Um,
positioning?
so nothing really has changed, but something which is probably not documented here is generally when it comes to infrastructure, front-end engineering teams have less say. And this is a infrastructure company. It's a system that is deployed on your cloud. Of how do we how does a front-end engineer sort of convince, or how do we equip a front-end engineer, or what is the possibility that an engineering manager listens to a front-end engineer's recommendation for a solution which is deployed on the back end,
Yeah,
so that piece we still that kind of is one question mark that I have.
yeah. Maybe that warrants another section here. We can just put that under a note, but it's basically adoption challenges. And adoption challenges, one of the adoption challenges that you face is if the front end persona is the one who wants this, how do they in turn in, influence the organization's willingness to adopt a solution like tail call, given that it's going to impact back end teams and also ops? Yeah. Okay. And that could be maybe where on the full website that has all the marketing for the product, you actually do carve out a whole section on that's specifically talking to the back end engineer and another one that's talking to that ops. Okay, so I think we have enough to proceed. One of the questions is, what do we want to get out of this session today? Do we want to think about a new README for the GitHub project, or do we want to think about a new homepage for tail call? And obviously, anything we come up with in this session, you don't have to turn it into any, you don't have to ship it, and you don't have to turn it into a real website. We're just using this to explore positioning. But like, do you think we should be focusing on the homepage or more on the GitHub README because they have very different formats, and we're going to have a lot more flexibility, but also we're going to be a lot more sensitive to layout issues on a website than we will on a README.
I think the website,
Okay.
readme just gives you like a teaser of what
Yes,
tail call is, but readme also needs to be in line with what we are saying on the website,
that's right.
so primarily
Okay.
the website though.
Okay, all right. So we did this at the end of last session, but I think it would be helpful again to take a look at that homepage and let's run through it real quick. Maybe take 6, maybe even 7 minutes to take a look at this homepage and look at the
Sure.
different elements that exist right now and think about at a high level, do we want to add new stuff in here? Do we want to take stuff away? Do we want to change some of these elements? So first off, I like the big, uh, basically, splash or hero screen here, which it's just so empty. It brings your attention to the one sentence description, which is that header there, GraphQL platform engineered for scale. That's like, I always like to think about education as teaching in layers, and you have your big picture, which is tail call. That doesn't tell you a lot. So you zoom in, and what's the next level? GraphQL platform engineered for scale. And then you zoom in again, and now you have your elevator pitch, which is that full sentence that you have right underneath that sort of second level. So that's the third level of detail, which is Tailcall is a high performance open source API orchestrator that enables organizations to construct unified data access layers on top of existing APIs. Okay. And then you have a call to two calls to action. The one you believe is going to be more likely, and the one you want people to do more is learn more because you're highlighting that one. And then you have get started as a secondary call to action. I like the basic structure of this. I think we can tweak some things and obviously wording and whatnot, but having a, a splash or hero screen like this that focuses the user on exactly what this solution is and who it's for, I think is quite useful. All right, let's scroll down. And by the way, just so I understand, what's the difference between learn more and get started? Are you there?
Yep, sorry, maybe my net. I can hear you.
Okay, no worries. What's the difference between learn more and get started?
um Get started actually just takes you directly to the installation
Okay,
page,
right.
right?
So this is like, I already know what this is about. I'm already
Yep,
sold.
yep.
Here's how I build Hello World.
Yeah.
And then learn more is I'm not yet sold, please sell me.
This is the whole story that I kind of talked about in the beginning of this
Yeah.
conversation
Okay.
today. So,
All right. Fantastic. Let's back up and walk through the next element.
so the get started is basically this is a small teaser of how can you just start off. So you just write your schemas, define all your APIs, very easy to kind of connect to HTTP services, and then you just say tail call start, point it to a file, it just starts with it. That's how it works.
So this is the teaser that
Yeah.
shows a potential user what this looks like. I think this is especially appreciated by developers. If a developer checks out a library or a framework or something like that, instantly the first thing they want to see is a snippet of code. Show me what it looks like to build something using this library or framework. And this is your equivalent here. Now, just one sort of quick note here, which is that we identified in the last session, not every potential user of tail call is going to be familiar with GraphQL at the outset. Maybe we don't have to do anything with that, but it is worth just thinking about. Okay, next session.
Mm,
So
and
it's
then
it's
there's a
credibility actually.
yeah,
Let's not skip the
yeah.
logos.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So the sections like this are great because they show you that a solution is trusted by third parties. They attempt to establish credibility in the audience, and listing logos is, of course, a great way to do that. And at some point, even testimonials and quotes about how amazing this is, how it sort of radically simplified or changed the way someone was building front-end APIs. Okay, next one.
This is a comparison with an API gateway because a lot of times um, the equivalent of what we're doing is sort of an API gateway. An API gateway is basically today, if you see in the market, does literally everything for an API with an API. And here we sort of talk about why an API gateway is not exactly what you need for this, for a use case like this.
Yeah. Okay, so this is interesting. I'm trying to figure out uh, who this is for and why it's here on the homepage. It seems like, is this for someone who is thinking, I need an API gateway, and then they stumble into tail call? Or is this for someone who goes to this website and says, this sounds an awful lot like an API gateway. Please clarify why it's different than an API gateway.
I think you can also already see that this website right now is sort of positioned towards backend or
Yeah?
platform engineers kind of
Yes.
profiles, right? So a backend engineer knows what an API gateway is.
Yeah.
And if they have to solve this problem of the API composition, they embed that logic or DSL or whatever that is on the gateway because they feel that's the most natural place for doing any kind of API composition.
Yeah.
And we are just kind of expanding on that idea that doing it on an API gateway is probably not the best for
Yeah.
these kind of things.
Right. Okay. So this is targeting the backend engineer who knows about API gateways and they're wondering why they shouldn't use an API gateway instead of tail call.
Yeah.
Okay, another issue to consider here is in positioning tail call, is it better to position it as, I think you used the terminology API platform in the one line pitch above, GraphQL platform. Okay,
API
or API, right,
orchestrator. Yeah.
right. So API orchestrator or GraphQL platform, is it better to use that terminology, or is it better to latch onto something people already know? Because API gateway is something people know. Is it better to latch onto that and say, well, we're just an API gateway? And then they're like, oh, well, so what? I don't care. And we're like, but we're an API gateway that can do things that the other ones can't. We're a better API gateway versus we're not an API gateway at all. Because actually, we have this problem in Golem, which is open source project. I'm wearing the Golem t-shirt here that my company works on, which is that technically we're in the space of durable execution, but no one knows what that is. So we're in a really tough position there because we can't talk about ourselves in that space without confusing people who are in our target market. And I wonder if you are in a little bit the same position here, because as far as I know, the terminology of API orchestration, it exists, but it's very niche, and there's probably not a whole lot of people who know what that is. What are your thoughts?
I think API gateway is we shouldn't compare ourselves to an API gateway. This because the gateway really needs a lot more features. And when you think about gateways, you're thinking about
Yes.
routing. There's an API call that is
Yes.
coming in and you're routing it to a service. That's not what tail call is. I mean, it is in a way routing, but that's not the main feature that tail call kind of brings about, right? And then there's rate limiting, there's a lot of circuit breaking, a lot of such security capabilities that API gateways kind of talk about, which is not the core of Tailcore.
Okay, so I think you make a good point, which is that if we put tail call in the category of API gateway, then suddenly people are going to be asking, do you have this feature? Do you have that feature? Do you have this other feature? And the answer is going to be no, we don't have that because that's not really our bread and butter. That's not our main business here. Our main business is something else that an API gateway won't even touch. So let me ask you this. Is it conceivable someone would use tail call and an API gateway together?
Yes, ideally.
And what would the architecture look like? Would that be tail call on the front end, API gateway right underneath that, and then microservices and so forth beneath that?
That's a very interesting question because I've seen both architectures where so the request comes from the client, hits a GraphQL instance. That instance talks upstream to a gateway,
Yeah,
and then the opposite where the gateway is in front of this layer. So it depends, I guess, on how in fact, there are a lot of ingress and egress gateways. So you have a gateway on both sides.
yeah,
So that could also be a reasonable architecture to kind of use.
interesting. So this where traditional gateways fail is not so much you don't need the API gateway you're using. It's that you're missing something that an API gateway can't give you, and tail
Yeah.
call is that thing. Okay, so let's think about this. I still think we have to answer the question of does this belong on the homepage or not? But we can answer that in a moment. All right, what's the next section?
Then we talk about the features, all the things that Tailcall
Yes.
gives you. The first feature is orchestration, which is just composition of APIs. And it can do it across protocols, gRPC, REST, or GraphQL. So even if you have a GraphQL API, it has the capability to compose a GraphQL with a REST or a gRPC with a GraphQL or REST with a gRPC, those kind of things, right?
Yeah.
So it can compose across protocols and the DSL remains the same. We also talk about the governance capabilities of APIs. Like I said, if say for example you have a user API which is exposing PII information, you want to show that PII information internally but not externally. If you don't have tail
Yes.
call, you'll end up creating multiple APIs or some sort of facade, which is one is public facing, one is internal. But with the tail call, you could actually annotate these types and say, okay, these types are only visible on these conditions. You know,
Okay.
so that gives you a lot of control. You could also governance is also about, for example, an entity like user, as if you are in a large organization, might not reside in a single service. A user could span over, 15 services. Every service
Yes.
has some part of that user information. But what you want to do is you want to give, at least to the consumer, an illusion of, one user entity,
Yeah.
right? So you just want to say, okay, I want users friends and I want users posts and
Yes.
profile and some PIA information or whatever that is. And that whole unified experience requires you to do a lot of governance. You want to say, okay, these types are sort of similar. This is not. This is available at these conditions. All those kind of things. And with our DSL, you can kind of express that very easily. So
Okay.
um, that's what the governance. I don't know if it comes across when you read this, but that's the idea.
Right. Okay. And let's just think about this for a second. Actually, maybe we should write these features down because some of them we're probably going to want to preserve in our
Mhm.
redesigned homepage.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe open up a new section there just for sort of new positioning and put a bullet point list there that includes the features. So, yeah, and we can add orchestration and then governance. So for orchestration here, it sounds like this is the main reason why someone comes to tail call is orchestration. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then governance would be like a nice to have, but not a must have. Is that right?
I would,
I
I
mean, if
mean,
that's
if
not
it,
right,
you are, it's an important feature. It's like this problem has been solved by so many companies already,
yes,
that just giving orchestration is not enough. So
yes.
if you want to make a real impact, you need to have some good governance capabilities.
Okay, so if someone wants orchestration, they have lots to choose from. And
Yeah.
then differentiating tail call from other solutions is better governance, easier
Yeah.
governance.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. And it seems like a lot of the orchestration facilities out there are in the API gateway category space and more focused on HTTP. Is that
Yeah.
correct, do you think?
Yeah.
Okay, which leads me to a second question. Can like is GraphQL orchestration unique enough that there's very few other players in this space, and that could be the thing that drives you to choose tail call, even in the absence of features like governance and so forth.
What do you mean by GraphQL orchestration? Like
I mean,
GraphQL
orchestration with a
upstream?
GraphQL front end. You're basically creating a GraphQL API that is, of course, implemented through the orchestration of lots of different other APIs.
Um, there are quite a lot of solutions that do that right now, right? And most of
So,
them are handwritten.
so do it yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we can ignore do it yourself, but basically what I'm trying to figure out here is because, generally it's not a great thing. It's not a great position to be in if, and you can still, I think, succeed doing this. It's just not an ideal position if in order to win over users, you have to start sort of feature cramming, right? If you have to start adding lots and lots of features, you're basically saying our core value proposition is incremental and not disruptive. And if your core value proposition is incremental, it's like, 0.1% better or 2% better, or let's even say 4% better. That's oftentimes not enough to convince someone to use it. So you've got to throw in this and that and so forth. And each one adds another 0.5% or percent. And eventually, if you have enough features, you can persuade people to use it. The problem with that is that it's not very friendly to startup open source projects. So new open source projects that are trying to enter a space because they suffer from a lack of resources and manpower. And so ideally in the perfect world, and if this is not the case, that's fine. We'll deal with that. But in the perfect world, there would be something, some core here in tail call that a user would say, well, if I'm looking at this, tail call's by far the best. If I need this, tail call wins hands down. Because what that allows you to do is focus in on those users who have such deep pains around that they're willing to put up with the fact that you don't have this feature and that feature and this feature and that feature. A great example of that is real-time collaborative editing. In the early days, there was this company who came up with this one-page website called Etherpad, and the only feature of that text editor was you could all type at the same time in the same document. They didn't have formatting, they didn't have anything except for that one feature. But it was so useful and so extremely compelling, people would use Etherpad, despite the fact that it didn't have all the features of Microsoft Word. And that's sort of what we're looking for here in Tail Call is that one so defining feature set that solves a big, huge, important pain that everyone else is ignoring, that people are willing to use Tail Call even if you don't have every single other thing that other similar solutions might have just yet.
The way I think about this is, can you see my screen by the way?
I
Like
can,
both,
yeah,
you can see the
I
website
can see
also.
the document. I can see tail
Oh
call
wait,
open source.
okay, wait. Let me actually share my whole screen. I just have
And
this in split. Sorry.
Baldwin has another question, which is considering that tail call knows all three protocols, GraphQL, gRPC, and REST, isn't then GraphQL too prominent in the beginning of the page? And I know the answer to that, but go ahead, you answer that one. That's a very good question. And I think demonstrates that we're confusing people with our current positioning and we need to change that. So go ahead and answer that question.
So the key is, the way it sort of works, the foundations are sort of built on GraphQL. It doesn't need to be, but if we don't talk about GraphQL upfront, it it becomes too vague of a problem or space to be in. API orchestration is like probably durable computing is too vague. It's difficult to kind of understand. You talk to somebody that you need some sort of a API orchestration layer. They'd be like, I don't know if that's a real problem for me, right? GraphQL is a lot of people actually know that GraphQL as a technology exists, and you can kind of build on why GraphQL exists and why Facebook sort of created GraphQL, and that sort of helps people understand the problem space a little better. But if you go the other way around from first principles, try to explain, it, why GraphQL, I mean, what API orchestration is, it's it's more confusing in general.
Right. And
So
also I think
yeah,
tail call is used to construct a new GraphQL interface to existing systems, which can be some combination of gRPC, REST, and GraphQL. However, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, you can't stand up a new gRPC interface or a new REST interface on top of all these other systems. In other words,
yeah.
Tailcall is right now just for launching new GraphQL APIs.
You can actually expose a REST endpoint
Okay.
on top of Tailwind. Yeah.
Okay, so you
So
can. So you can expose new REST endpoints
yep.
as well as new GraphQL endpoints. Okay, fantastic. So that's great. Go ahead and continue. You were sharing your whole screen to show us something?
Um, so I think you're talking about, what's the most differentiating, unique
Yes.
proposition for Tailcall, right?
Yeah.
I think the key thing that we sort of learned over the years was writing. Let's just talk about GraphQL first, okay? So writing a GraphQL layer by hand is extremely hard. It's
Yes.
unscalable, it's unmaintainable because it's almost like saying, for a database, I'm going to write my SQL engine.
Yes.
If databases gave you the storage mechanism, but you had to implement a SQL engine every time,
Yes.
that's that's never going to work, right? So what you
Yeah.
want is you want a SQL interface that you can use with your database. So in the same way, if you think about it, you sort of draw the same parallels here. You want GraphQL to be like a black box, which is connected to your data sources, and it does RPC calls to get that data. It does query planning, it does all kind of caching, all kinds of optimizations so that you don't have to.
Yes.
And you can do that with tail call because it provides you a DSL which is introspectable. It understands, what's coming in, what's going out, and it has all that information ahead of time because it's a config.
Yes.
Right? So that sort of is the key differentiating capability from when you compare to others, because everybody else, in most of the other solutions, you have to write code,
Yes.
which is not introspectable. So you don't know what's going to. You're basically writing your query engine by hand, so it doesn't scale.
Okay. So that seems to be saying that because GraphQL, writing a performance scalable GraphQL solution is so challenging, you're not going to end up being successful, or at least it's going to take you a lot of time and a lot of pain if you try to do that by hand. So Tailcall gives you all of these features such as caching and versioning and so forth, and joining whatever sorts of complexities underlie writing your own, rolling your own GraphQL API to make it worthwhile to use this solution instead of any other.
Let me give you a really complex example. For
Yeah.
example, you have a use case. where you need to query 5 APIs.
Yes.
You need to first figure out what is the order of querying those APIs.
Yes.
So the client makes one request, and to get that data, you need to make these 5 calls. So you need to know the order in which these calls have to be made. And you need to sort of optimize it. Some calls don't depend on others, and if that's the case, you kind of prefetch them. It's possible that one of those 5 calls needs authentication.
Yes.
So if you need authentication, you might want to move that authentication request to the front. Unless the request is unless the user is authenticated, don't start making these 5 calls.
Yes.
Don't make any call, because it's
Yeah.
ultimately if the fifth call ends up being the user being unauthenticated, the whole request is failing, right? So
Yeah.
this is intelligence you want to build. If you handwrite all of this code, it becomes a mess
That's
eventually.
right. Yeah.
And what we propose is, we introspect, we identify this is an auth request, we'll move it to the front. This can be parallelized, we'll make these requests. We'll find n+1, like if there's a batch API. So for example, we want to get list of users. If there's a batch API, we'll make that call, get it automatically for you without you worrying about it. So without you writing a lot of code, you are able to achieve so much, like a
Yes.
real database query engine.
So this is interesting. It's almost like there's two things going on here, which is going to make positioning more challenging. One thing going on, if I could summarize it, it would be GraphQL gives you what you need as a front-end engineer. And then the second thing is setting up a GraphQL API that's performant and scalable is really, really hard.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's going to be interesting because we really don't want to be in the position of we can do it if necessary, but it's going to affect the way we position this. We don't really want to be in the position of selling GraphQL. That said, if we have to, we can solve this problem by raising up our positioning higher so that in the sort of 50,000 foot pitch, we're not even talking GraphQL. We're talking pains that the front end engineer has. And then later on, we're like, oh, and GraphQL turns out to be the perfect solution to your pains, but you don't want to do it on your own because it's too hard. We give you that for free. That's a solution I would rather avoid, but we can do that if necessary. The next question is, are the set of people, front end engineers, who know that GraphQL is a solution for a lot of the problems that they, as front end engineers, face, is that big enough to be interesting to tail call, or is it too small?
It's big enough considering the stage we are in, at least right
Okay.
now. So we are early stage. So it's big enough in that sense.
All right. So what's your personal preference there? Should we be assuming the front end engineer knows all the wonderful benefits of GraphQL and is coming to tail call because of SEO around GraphQL, and then we don't have to pitch them on why GraphQL or the pains that GraphQL is going to help them solve. We only have to pitch them on here's how you can get your preferred GraphQL API stood up in a day instead of 2 months. And it's going to be performant and scalable and all that stuff out of the box. It's a
What
big
do you
question.
think? What are your thoughts? How do you think about it?
I mean, there's so many front-end engineers, so that's the good thing. So even if the average front-end engineer doesn't know anything about GraphQL, um, there's still probably hundreds of thousands who do. And then in there, probably a lot of them have a good experience and are senior enough to know why it is GraphQL solves, like, for example, not having to do client-side joins and so forth, all the pains that GraphQL solves for you. And within that percentage, some of them probably still like GraphQL. So I think despite the fact that there's so many sort of intersecting circles here, every one which narrows our target market, I think it still might be big enough to be interesting for tail call stage. But I could be persuaded otherwise as well. It's tough.
I think if you have like a focus, if you have a user group, at least to start with, like a group
Yeah.
which has a problem and there's nothing solving that problem right
Yeah.
now, no matter how small it is, it's a good space to be in,
Yes. Yeah.
right? Like I can talk about from my experience, like Zio actually brought me into Scala
Yeah.
primarily,
Yeah.
right?
That's great.
And right, so and I think that's true for a lot of such products. Like if we can solve the problem for a small set of users
Yes.
who are just suffering with pain and like it's
Yes.
not a good experience right now, that's a good place to be in.
I like that. Okay. So orchestration, um, I don't want to spend too much time here because we've already spent a lot of time, but I think it's been very useful. But also just thinking more about that, if the user who comes, the front end engineer who comes to the tail call website is looking for good ways to get what they want out of a new GraphQL API, so good tooling or platform or library or SDK around that, then they're probably already considering other solutions. Do you have any idea of what they would be? And here I'm thinking like what GraphQL library would they use to roll their own GraphQL API as a sort of backend for the front end in JavaScript or TypeScript? And also, like, is there another solution that lets you? I know there's lots of solutions out there that let you add a GraphQL API to a database.
Yeah.
But are there other solutions that let you add GraphQL API to a bunch of microservices or REST APIs? And if so, what are they?
So you are talking about black box solutions that you just deploy, connect to
It could be
APIs.
open source. It could even be source code, but there's got to be something out there. Obviously, there are libraries that help you implement GraphQL servers
Yeah.
in in TypeScript and JavaScript, and we should make a list of that. In fact, I would actually make a list here of like competitors and adjacent space. Yeah, so
So
what's here?
Hasura is the main one, right? Hasura, it's an open source, yet another open source product, but it works like a black box, right? So it connects to any database. It can connect to databases. Uh,
So
that's not something
database
that we do.
only. Yeah.
Database and REST, HTTP
Oh,
calls.
okay. So
Like,
it can do REST as well. All right.
yeah, it's mostly a UI based tool. So you click, drag, drop, and that's how it works.
Okay.
It's not like a DSL that you kind of work with really.
All right.
But because it's UI, I'm guessing it's introspectable and you can do a lot of optimizations.
Okay. Makes sense. Anything else that you are aware of in this space?
So I think we talked about Apollo GraphQL, which is basically it's a library.
So this is for those who are going down the path of do it
Yeah,
yourself
yeah,
and are
yeah,
willing to write a lot of code. And
yeah,
Hasura is for those who don't want to write any code.
yeah. These are the main players. Now, one very interesting thing about Apollo is they have a product called Federation.
Yeah.
Okay. And now the pitch over there is if you want to scale GraphQL, what you want to do is you want to have smaller GraphQL services. And then rather than doing composition at an API level, do a graph level composition,
Yeah.
right? So every system is sort of exposing a sub graph. And then
Yeah.
you create a global graph of all these systems. So that's a product that they have.
Interesting. And that has definite overlap, it seems, with tail call.
Yeah.
I would say both of these. I actually think Hasura is like in the same space, maybe not targeting the same persona. But let's just for ideas, let's open up Hasura's website and just see how they're talking about the product because we might learn something. So look at that data delivery. Okay, getting data to your apps, getting data to your mobile devices. That's a high level pitch. Very high level.
Yeah.
Effortlessly ship a fast and infinitely composable GraphQL API to enable flexible, secure, and reliable self-service access to any data, no matter its source. That is a good pitch. And the reason why is because it's just packed with things that matter to people who are in 9 to 5 positions effortlessly. Okay, it's going to be very easy. Ship, right? It's not just build, it's like get into production tomorrow. Fast, that's going to appeal to the back end engineer as well as maybe ops. Infinitely composable. Well, I don't know about that one, but it sounds nice. to enable flexible, and we talked about using that terminology for the front end persona who cares about flexibility and security, reliability, all of these things, self-service access. That is a very good pitch. It's not targeting a front end persona, but it is still nonetheless a very good pitch that's focusing on pains.
Yeah,
And
but they
then,
are at a different stage overall.
oh yeah, I
They're
agree.
much bigger.
Yeah.
So
What works for
their
them is not
position
going to
has
work
to
for
be, yeah,
us.
yeah,
It
yeah,
it has to be big.
yeah,
Um, and as you get even bigger, you don't need to pitch yourself anymore. Like
yeah,
AWS, good luck finding a pitch for AWS. You're not going to find one.
yeah, yeah. And guess what the stack is? What language are they built in?
C, C++,
Haskell.
Haskell? Wow,
Yeah,
crazy. Wow. Okay, and then the future of data APIs. Data API. I like that because it distinguishes from just arbitrary. I guess GraphQL is inherently a data API, but it's like they don't want to go all in on GraphQL because that's a little scary, maybe because people don't know GraphQL. So they're like data API instead of GraphQL.
yeah.
What else do they have here? This is their feature checklist, pretty much. But here's something that I think we should learn from in the tail call website. It's just the fact that whenever you talk about a feature, you can talk about the sort of knob or the gear, or you can talk about the problem that it solves. And what they're trying to do, maybe not entirely successfully in all cases, but they're trying to talk about the pain that it solves. Like, for example, ultra performant. Is that a feature? Yes, but it's talking, no, it's actually probably a combination of a lot of product level features. And it's talking about the pain that all those features combine to solve. And same way with composability or modern dev experience and operational excellence, they're trying to not talk about individual features in isolation, but rather the impact they're going to have on a developer or a business or the ops team and so forth. And that's one of the things that we should do when we run through the features of tail call is focus on the pains. Even if we're still talking about features or mapping them to features, always be focusing on the pains. Okay, what else do they have? Anything else interesting? Just more pitches, basically. Call to action. Okay. Yeah, this is a much more mature product, so not everything here is going to be useful for tail call. Like you say, I
That's
think we have
correct.
to keep in mind the stage.
Yeah.
But still, there's some good stuff here. And how about Apollo GraphQL? Let's take a quick look at that one.
For a while, they had something to do with AI, I think. I mean, the pitch was,
The modern API platform. No, the API platform for the modern stack. Build a GraphQL platform that aggregates and orchestrates APIs across any number of clients and services. That's interesting.
this is closer to what I have today.
Yes, that's right. I sense they're not as far along, maybe, or maybe as like laser focused as Hajura. I think this is reasonable. And then they have their credibility section. They're like new to GraphQL Federation. They're trying to. This is going to be very confusing to people outside the space. They're trying to head off that problem there in this Gartner report, as well as build credibility. Okay, that's a nice, clear pitch. Enables back-end teams. Interesting, they're targeting back-end teams to build a self-service, self-documenting graph. And we talked
This
about that being
graph,
the strength of GraphQL. Yeah.
so Graph OS is the product, is also known as GraphQL Federation, if I'm not wrong. So the Federation is this product. So they
Okay.
rebranded it as Graph OS, which is basically an operating system on top of graphs. So,
This is really interesting that they're explicitly targeting back-end teams in this positioning, which is maybe a sign that in bigger companies, even it might be a back-end team who's ultimately
yeah,
responsible for something like this.
yeah.
Okay, define data once, deliver anywhere, consistent user experiences. This is not really something that's going to be relevant, I don't think. It's very high level positioning. I like that one. Deliver features faster. That should be something that we are saying.
Yeah.
Deliver them faster, be more flexible, be more agile, get the front end exactly what it needs. There's that concept of self-service for front end, which goes back. That's actually a back end marketing because it's like you don't have to deal with them.
Yep. Yep.
Let them deal with themselves. Improve port performance. So they're like they're very much like don't worry about all the pesky things those front end engineers are going to do. We're going to handle it in a way that maximizes performance.
So one of the things between the difference between Hasura and Apollo is actually both of them are slow because Hasura is written Haskell. It's not a very fast solution, but they say they're fast because GraphQL inherently is a very efficient system, because if you're using GraphQL, it's optimizing a lot of IO calls. In
Yes.
that sense, it's improving, it's logically, I mean, speaking, this is what it's doing. It's improving performance across application. It's in itself, it might not be very efficient. In itself, it might be a very slow system.
Yes. And then credibility, massive credibility section as you would expect for targeting the enterprise, trying to de-risk this. Okay. All right. Well, this is really good. Let's go back to our document and just copy over a list of features from the existing website. I think we're going to change the structure of those somewhat, but
Hmm.
we'll want to make sure that we speak to the strengths of tail call. And probably you've already done a good job in this existing feature list of capturing those unique strengths. So orchestration, governance, what's the next one? Efficiency, extendability, and then the rest of that stuff down there. Yeah, I would just copy all of that into our document. And I thought we were actually going to start writing copy in this session, but apparently I overestimated how fast we would work. I still feel like we did a tremendous amount of useful work today
Of course,
because
yeah.
I have a much better understanding of the space, the competitors, and why tail call. Like going back to that question of what drives people to tail call that they can't get elsewhere, the answer is those two aspects that I mentioned. It's GraphQL, which by the way gives the front end engineer everything they want and need, even if they don't know it. And it's efficient, easy, scalable, performant GraphQL. And solving that problem on your own is something you would never want to take on yourself. So the combination of those two things, which are driving people to tail call. And we have two examples that you've identified in this session of other companies who are talking. That's so helpful. Why? Because they've been doing it for 5 or 10 years already. So they've
Yeah.
learned a lot of lessons. And and like you say, this is very insightful. We can't just copy the positioning of a bigger company because it changes. Nike doesn't even tell you what they do on their homepage because everyone knows what Nike does. It's the same thing for us. We've got to focus on something that's more startup friendly, which means our marketing's not going to look the same. But nonetheless, I still think we can look at what they've done and learn some lessons, like the pain points they're using. Azure in particular, like it's really hitting on a lot of pains and we can capitalize on that and turn that into some, I think, marketing material that's going to be very specific to tail call and it's going to get people excited about it. We do need to think a bit more before we actually write the copy on this question of front end versus back end. And the only reason I'm thinking about it is because the Apollo and even to
Yeah.
some extent the Hajura marketing were very squarely focused on back end.
Yeah.
The Apollo was just back end, back end, back end, back end everywhere, and they might know something. They might know
Yeah.
that, like in bigger companies, even if the front end teams can and would be doing it themselves, if they were building their own back end for the front end, that in practice, when it's GraphQL, it's the back end engineers building that because of complexity or who knows what else.
Exactly. So that's why we've also kind of focused a lot on backend that and less on front end.
Yes.
Uh,
Well,
but
let's think about
if it
that
was,
for a week.
yeah,
We'll come
sure.
back and we'll try to put together the layout as well as the copy for a tail call homepage in the next session.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot,
All
Tushar.
right.
Have a great week.
Thank you, John.
See you
See you.
next
Bye
week.
bye.